Oh,
Hi. How are you?
calling. Yeah. Hi. Good to see you. Calling Chris Anderson. So wait a minute. There's no Pilot Books behind you. Where are you? Are you in a hotel? Are you in Belgium? Oh, okay. Okay. Wow. That's like magic. That's the magic of video.
It's the action cam.
Well, I can do that. Well, I can do the
We have
high
our action cam. There you
high
go.
shot. Right there you go. Okay. Let's just relax, everybody. Welcome to History Happy Hour. I'm in Chicago. You figured it out. Thank you to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for their assistance in bringing you this show and for sending us on tours from time to time. Check out the rich offering of military history tours at StephenAmbroseTours.com. Yeah. Since we last spoke,
Did something happen?
The Chicago Bears did play an amazing game last Sunday night.
And
it was fourth down.
Just get on with it. And
in the fourth quarter. No, I'm going to tell the story. I'm going to relive the moment. Fourth down.
I'm on the edge of my seat.
Caleb Williams goes back. The Bears are down by 7. He goes back. They're chasing him. He runs back. He started on the 15-yard line. He goes back. He goes back to the 40-yard line. From the 40-yard line, he throws long, hits Cole Kmet in the end zone. It's a extra point. It's a tie game.
Oh, it's not done yet. Okay.
No, then they lost in overtime. So it was close. It was exciting. It was frustrating, but the Bears were great this year. The town's all excited about them. So
all those positive vibes.
So next August, Chris, we can start talking about this again.
Yay!
Yeah, about six and a half months from now, I think we can pick this conversation up.
The joy never ends.
I know. Hey, and guys, whether you're watching live or watching on replay or listening in your car to the HHH podcast, we're glad you're here. The joy is continuing on. And today we'll have an encore episode about the capture of the German U-boat U-505. I am in, as the show goes on the air, in New Orleans on a combination business and pleasure trip. And so there's that. Hey, Chris, we should mention our Patreon supporters.
Yes, we should.
And we have a new one.
I know.
Who is that?
I can't.
And it's Greg Jones. You haven't memorized this list and you can't automatically see when a new name comes up?
No, but Greg, we do really appreciate you joining us.
We do, Greg. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And now we really are. We get one more. I swear we're going to 2 pages.
I mean, poor Susan, man. She's always kind of like just hanging on to the edge.
Susan, we're glad you're there.
We love Susan, but I want to kind of give her some space. I kind of feel
yeah. So Top Shelf patron. You can become one at patreon.com/History Happy Hour. Okay. So, Chris, I'm sure that we have a growing audience. I'm sure that they have cocktails. They're telling us. They're probably telling us what cocktails they have.
They probably are saying,
So we should probably get on and bring them to the show. So give me a cue and we'll get to it.
You said it was still working.
I did. I just did it.
I didn't hear it. No. Did anybody else out there hear the bell? No bell.
I'm ringing the bell.
All right, whatever. All right, you
okay.
All right. Can I bring our guest on now?
The bar is open. Let me introduce our guest first.
All
okay.
Right.
In June 1944, sailors from the mysterious 10th Fleet boarded an enemy vessel for the first time the U.S. had boarded an enemy vessel since the War of 1812. It was a submarine, the U-505, now at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. And how exactly it was captured is the subject of a new book by Alexander Rose called Phantom Fleet: The Hunt for Nazi Submarine U-505 and World War II's Most Dramatic Heist. And Alex Rose is a journalist and author of numerous history books. One of them, Washington Spies, was adapted to the AMC drama series Turn, for which he served as a writer and producer. He has a doctorate from Cambridge, Chris. Okay, so we have to be very careful here.
A decent school, then.
He was born in the United States, raised in Australia, and educated in Britain. Obviously, can't decide what country to stay in, but he lives right now in New York City. And now you can bring on Alex Rose.
All right, here we go. Ta-da!
Hey, how are you?
Hey, how are you?
Alex, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's a
you.
pleasure to be here, as they say.
Thank you.
We're delighted. And Chris, I know Alex, you don't have a drink, but Chris, you have a drink, right?
Of course I do. Yeah, because
What do
Vladimir
you-
brought me a gin and tonic.
Oh yeah, I don't know why David Otley didn't bring me a
We
drink.
talked about that.
I just have a glass of water, but I can say this as vodka if you
Yes, you can.
Excellent.
Like,
Please do.
dramatic,
Please
yes.
do.
Heard of the thing.
Before I start asking you, difficult and penetrating questions, which is probably never going to happen, but I did want to mention that we have a very faithful viewer, Wally Morrison, who is the son of a crewman on the USS Guadalcanal, which of course you know is the aircraft carrier that led the U-505 chase. And his dad's name was Chief Irwin J. Morrison, and I'm sure Wally will have some interesting questions. Here's a picture of his dad and his mom, Gloria, at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago when the U-505 was open to the public in the 1950s. So, Chris, I have a good way to keep up with the comments, so you're going to have to keep an eye on there. And if Wally's got something,
So I'm just saying it wasn't just me.
okay. Okay. So, and Alex is okay to call you Alex, right? I've been doing that,
Oh, absolutely, yes. Go.
You don't. It doesn't
No
have to go with the
problem.
whole. Okay. So you begin the book in. Actually, my first question is, how did you get from Abraham Woodhull and the other characters of Turn to suddenly be writing about the U-505? Seems like kind of a big jump.
No, you're right. It is a bit of a big jump. I mean, I tend to jump around as a writer anyway. I write a book about a certain subject, and then I go, okay, I know about that subject now, so let me do the next subject. I mean, so in that sense, it is a big jump of mathematics skills, 200 years or so. But but at the same time, it is connected as well, in that I tend to specialize, or I have an interest in kind of historical intelligence, serious intelligence history. So, Washington Spies was about George Washington's private spying during the War of Independence. And then I did a book a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, I think, something like that, 3 years ago, called The Lion and the Fox, which was about two Civil War spies, one Northern, one Southern, and who were actually based in England during the Civil War, where they spied the daylights out of each other. So that was another bit of an intelligence. And this book now has its action, with the actual heist and hunt for, or the heist of U-505. But the hunting bit, which took place before that, is really based on essentially good intelligence work from 10th Fleet and an analyst in Washington, based in the Maine Navy, which is the Navy headquarters in Washington D.C. So there is that intelligence component to it.
So Alex, you focus on three individuals: Daniel Gallery, Kenneth Knowles, and Oberleutnant Harold Lange, and we'll get probably more into that as we go along. But your story in the book seems very personality driven, which as a liberal arts guy, I really appreciate, because most naval history gets really dull and very, very confusing. Why did you focus on these three, and why did you kind of look at this story again, like through personalities as opposed to your traditional naval history?
That's a great question. First, Lange is the sort of the last captain of U-505. He had two predecessors, but the book is really a kind of a two-hander between Kenneth Knowles in Washington, the aforementioned analyst, and then you have Daniel Gallery, who was the captain of the Guadalcanal, which was the hunter-killer group or task group, which actually caught the submarine. So it's really about those two men, and they didn't really know each other until quite near the end, but they were sort of connected through via the U-boat war. As for writing books about characters, which is essentially what this is, I worked this out a long time ago. and that is, when you write popular history as opposed to, say, academic history or something very, very straightforward like military history or Navy history, people want to read about people. I mean, that's what it really is. Otherwise, you get a kind of a narrative of, it's easy. It was easy to do this, just telling the tale of ships and that kind of thing. But to bring a story alive, to bring the real drama to a story, you need to have characters, who have conflicts and, have personalities and all this kind of stuff. And that brings the story alive. And, what I think is that when you are talking about these characters, you can then kind of slot in as background, what they're doing and explain sort of the wider world of World War II naval history. You see, so that's how you bring the past alive and sort of bring it home to people about what the stakes were, who these people were and how it all worked. And so I find it a very kind of liberating, almost novelistic, though I'm not making up anything, obviously, kind of novelistic or screenplay driven type of narrative of history. That's again, it's a certain sort of technique I've been kind of working on for quite a while now.
Well, it was appreciated because it allowed me to kind of get access to a story which otherwise could have either been dull or very kind of hard to follow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you paint a really interesting picture of submarine warfare in World War II. And I tend to think, when I think of submarine warfare, I think of Tom Hanks in Greyhound. He's depth charging German submarines, or the guys in Das Boot who are, torpedoing ships. But you kind of pull the camera back to look at the chess game being played between Berlin and Washington. I mean, it really is kind of a game of move and counter move. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, no, and again, I know what you're saying with Das Boot and the other great submarine movies and the idea we have of the Battle of the Atlantic. And again, there is that aspect to it, which is, again, very interesting, especially when you tell the story from what's actually happening in the submarine and how they're regarding, the Americans at close quarters, or the British and the Canadians at close quarters. But what was also interesting to me was, to look at, the history of it from the top of the hill. The actual supreme commanders of this. In the American version, it was Admiral Ernest King, who was Chief of Naval Operations, and the other one is Dönitz, who was the Grand Admiral, first in charge of the U-boat command, and then he got promoted to head the entire German Navy. And so they and their staffs are, as you say, playing a chess game. It was a gigantic chess game in the Atlantic, whereby submarines would be moved here and there and hither and thither, and the Americans and also the British, but I focus on the Americans, would counter that or try and anticipate where they were going, and then try and hunt them and then sink them. So I don't spend like hundreds of pages on this. It's just that it is important to understand how this tracking and heist of U-505 came about. It wasn't just by accident. It was the culmination of years worth of these sort of subtle chess moves back and forth. And the important thing is that also to remember is that Dönitz was a one-man sort of corporate hierarchy. I mean, he was the CEO, the CTO, the CFO, the COO of all naval high command, and he orchestrated his submarines movements. They just weren't going around hunting randomly for ships in the middle of a colossal water desert, so to speak. They were being orchestrated and conducted by a maestro, but it was a maestro who had real flaws in his direction, and that was exactly what the Americans and the British could exploit. To their great advantage.
So Alex, one of the things that I'm sure Rick does this too, we do tours and we have to describe how unprepared America was for war. And we say America had the 17th largest military in the world, and that was smaller than Romania, and it almost becomes formulaic. But in your book, you also talk about where we started in terms of naval warfare. And I hadn't realized how alarmingly bad it was. So, kind of at the start of your story, when America finds itself entering the war, what was the state of America's kind of anti-submarine capabilities, practices? Where did we start from?
There's a very short answer to that, and that is there really wasn't one. I mean, there was one in name. There was, anti-submarine forces, and there were depth chargers, and there were sub-chasers and destroyers. But it was all kind of like a Potemkin anti-submarine force. It didn't really exist. And again, because when you have firstly because of resources. I think the admiral in charge of the America's Atlantic Anti-Submarine Force in early 1942, so just a few weeks after Pearl Harbor. I mean, I think he had, again, it was an unspectacular number. He had something like 21 allegedly anti-submarine ships to hand. But really, half of them dated back to 1905 or pre-World War One. They were laid up in dry dock, or they were based in the South, or they were unsuited to winter conditions. So really, he was the Grand Admiral of a total of 3 ships at that time. So the American response was incredibly weak during what would become known as Operation Drumbeat, which was the first German wave of submarine attacks on the United States. In early 1942, for the first 3 or 4 months of 1942, and for a good number of months, the Americans really were on their back foot. I mean, I wouldn't even say they were on their back foot; they were on their back foot, and then someone sort of, judoed them, and they went flying. I mean, they really had no idea what they were doing, because working in anti-submarine is not just a matter of throwing a couple of depth charges off the back of the boat,
right?
And then boom. Submarine dies. It's there are hundreds of thousands of square miles of ocean. You have very few resources. People haven't been trained to fight submarines. I mean, they had very few anti-submarine aircraft, for instance, and the ones they had. Remember, all the good pilots had been, and this is in early 42, had been seconded or flown urgently to the Pacific to deal with the Japanese, because that was where the real danger was involved. They really weren't expecting a German attack on America. So the guys you had in the Army Air Force and the Naval Air Service, who detested each other, they hadn't been trained for sea work. I mean, the Army Air Force pilots, for instance, had third-rate planes, and they'd been trained to drop bombs on large, immobile cities, for instance. Whereas you needed a very certain type of armament and training to be able to distinguish, say, what a periscope looked like, or the trail or wake left behind by a telescope, but with a small moving object in the middle of nowhere. So the American anti-submarine capabilities in early 42, for the first 3 or 4 months, were really, just pretty terrible. Which is one of the reasons why there were such high civilian losses in terms of tankers and freighters and so on.
Well, and obviously there's a back and forth where it seems like one side is ahead for a while and another side is ahead, and part of this battle involves code breaking. And you refer to the expression "a wilderness of mirrors," and you say, "Make those mirrors the distorting funhouse variety, and it would go some way to describing the situation in the North Atlantic in 1942 and early 1943." So explain to us what you're talking about there.
Well, that goes back to what you could call the Enigma War, or the code-breaking war. Tracking submarines, people tend to exaggerate the importance of Enigma, which was the so-called unbreakable German code, which was, when it was actually decrypted and turned into English, became known as Ultra. People get that confused, but let's just stick with Enigma. And Naval Enigma was the toughest nut of all to crack. The Germans used dozens and dozens of various varieties of Enigma. It wasn't just one code and suddenly all your communications were an open book. Army and Luftwaffe, SS, Gestapo, they all had different varieties, some of which were never cracked by the Allies. But essentially, it was part of the sort of the tools at hand in order to be able to track submarines. Actually, just as important, or even more important, was sort of were radio transmissions that you could use to, if you pick them up, you could try and triangulate them. It was known as HFDUF, or high frequency direction finding, which was a kind of an art and a science in itself. There are also other ways that you could use. You would listen to German propaganda broadcasts. You would try and get German newspapers and so on, and you would it was essentially open source intelligence, what we would call it nowadays, in which you would pick up little hints about what Dönitz was thinking about, depending on if such and such a commander had been promoted, or someone had been demoted, or there was a hint in Dönitz's wording about the times will soon get tougher, which was thought to be kind of a euphemism for we are going to be moving operations, into the North Atlantic or something. So there was a lot of passing of these transmissions, and a lot of in POW interrogations. They didn't have many U-boat crew to interrogate, but when they had them, they would go over them, and just, I don't mean beat them up, but I mean, they would talk to them very carefully, and they would have real pro-grade interrogators learning everything about armament, tactics, how things worked, plans, code. Anything they could pick up, including gossip, about which captain really was thought to be a bit of a chicken. Which captain didn't like depth charges? What was such and such a captain's favorite alcoholic drink? All sorts of, sort of scuttlebutt that they could use, and then use that to leverage against new prisoners to sort of show that they knew more. They knew everything already, and that the person being interrogated was just going to clear up a few questions. It's an very old interrogator's trick to do that, to have this sort of omnipotent or omniscient knowledge. But getting back to the question, so there was this very long war back and forth. The Germans were aware that the British and the Americans were listening to their transmissions, and so they took countermeasures. They made their transmissions very short, so they couldn't be picked up very easily and triangulated. They spoke obviously in code. There would be like super coding, like a code on a code, along the lines of, pick up the coffee in Kansas, that kind of stuff. If you're, apparently if you watch The Sopranos, and they would also, it was under the captains were under very strict orders not to be chatty. You just made a very quick transmission to notice your position or to change something, and back to naval headquarters in France, to Dönitz's HQ, and you'd be told off if you talked too much, because it was deadly. And so there was this, again, the wilderness of mirrors is that they're getting in themselves confused. It gets more and more complicated, because
at one point the Germans break the British code. Right, and they're listening in on British, listening in on them essentially.
Yeah, there's something I wanted to bring out in the book, and that we tend to think, in terms of from movies and books and so on. There's a sort of in the Bletchley Park, which is the famous one. Bletchley Park kind of read German communications and Enigma symbols, and the Germans had no idea because they're all a bunch of blithering idiots. And they had no idea. No, they were quite well aware that their transmissions were being intercepted. They didn't know that it was being decrypted because it was thought to be unbreakable. And, but Dönitz himself was kind of twigged a few times that, there was just a few too many overly coincidental meetings between one of his submarines and a couple of destroyers, kind of in the middle of nowhere. And why is this happening? How did they find them? So there's a few sort of suspicions at Naval High Command about what is going on here. But so he ordered several investigations, and the German investigators looked into it very deeply. But they continue, and this is a real flaw. They kind of said they were under the sort of very strident, zealous belief that since the code could not be broken, then the code could not be broken. So there must be some other explanation for these overly coincidental meetings. They were kind of chasing their own tails. But at the same time, related to that, the Germans weren't stupid. They also had a very good interception department in what's known as for short the B-Dienst, which is German naval intelligence. A fellow called Tranau, if I got his name right, he was in charge of intercepting Allied communications. And what you're referring to is the Great Break, which one never really hears about, of what's known as Cipher Number 3, which in early 1942, like January, I think, up until December 1942, the Germans were reading Cipher Number 3, which is a colossal intelligence fumble by the Allies. What Cipher Number 3 was the convoy code used for convoys to, by convoy commanders to, for their orders from headquarters about which way to turn or to swerve or to circle around to a different port or whatever. And it was used by the Canadian, British, and American navies because it was simple and everyone knew it. The Germans were reading this, which is one of the reasons why they had such tremendous success throughout 1942, sinking convoys. The Allies were not aware of this. But at the same time, the weird thing is that at the same time, they would have been aware of this, but the Germans had brought in an advanced new Enigma machine with an advanced new code with sort of upgraded security procedures. So they weren't reading. Bletchley Park was essentially blinded for that year. It was like this kind of two ships, sort of almost literally passing in the night. And so that's what I was talking about with the Wilderness of Mirrors. There's this game, and then suddenly in 1943, both sides realize that the British and Americans get the jump on them, and they say, "Okay, we're going to change Cipher Number 3. This is insane." And once they did that, and they managed to break the new German naval enigma, then you suddenly see in 1943, along with tremendous new numbers of new destroyers coming online through the matchless American production capabilities that had taken a year to get up and running. Suddenly you see the great massacres of the U-boats from sort of May 1943, which is known as Black May among the U-boat crews because so many of them died during it. But that actually broke the back of the U-boat fleet. But it didn't mean it was defeated by any means. That was a very long answer to a simple question. I apologize.
No,
it's good.
One of the things, and we're going to turn towards U-505 because we're starting to get some queries about that. But people should know when they read your book, they're going to get a fantastic history of the whole U-boat war leading up to this, so you kind of understand everything that's been going on. And one of the things that really struck me, you talk a lot about different philosophies between the Allies about how to fight the U-boats. And
there were.
Then that will, impact the rest of the story. So, what are the two different philosophies, and how does that impact the story?
The two basic philosophies regarding dealing with U-boats, and this stems from early 1942. Remember the British had been fighting U-boats for, they had 2 years or a year and a half worth of experience on the Americans. From their view, to fight U-boats, there was no way to find U-boats. The ocean was just too colossal. You couldn't find them like a hunting dog or anything like that. To the British mind, when you put convoys together, so long as you put a few destroyers around it, acting almost as sheepdogs, the wolves were a little bit scared. They would be, the U-boat commanders were a little bit, apprehensive about what would happen. So they would almost call off a lot of attacks. From the British perspective, if you could fend off or just prevent an attack from ever happening, so long as the convoy got through to a very beleaguered little island off the coast of France that had recently been almost invaded, then that was counted as a success. Because Britain relies, like 99% of its rubber, for instance, comes from abroad, and the colossal amounts of its oil, minerals, bauxite, all this kind of stuff, food, quite a lot of the food. So They had that approach, and that was have defensive convoys. As long as the convoys get through, everything's great. Under King, King was a fighting admiral. I mean, he was this sort of Nelson-like figure. He was a Patton type sort of equivalent, and that to his mind, that it was okay, right, to be defensive right now. I mean, the Americans had very few destroyers available. They were still being buffeted by German attacks on their coastline. So yes, and he agrees with the principle of convoys. He's got no problem with convoys. It's a sensible thing to do. But his view is that it was just like being a boxer who puts his hands up. You can do that for a while, but you can't actually win a fight. You just keep on taking hits or fending them off. You have to land knockout blows. So to his mind, for the time being, we're going to go along with the Brits, and we are going to be defensive about our convoys. But the plan was right there from the beginning, and he told them so, and they were quite horrified by this because it was a highly risky strategy. And that is, we are going to be developing destroyers and aircraft, and we are going to go out and we are going to hunt down these wolves in their lairs. We're going to go out and find them and kill them. So to his mind, the more submarines you sank, the better it was, because Dönitz would not be able to keep up with the production. So that was the great difference in philosophy between the Americans and the British. The British would reply, "Well, that's all great for you with your 3,000-mile wide moat between you and a highly aggressive enemy. That's great, but we really need these supply lines running at maximum efficiency, because otherwise things like Operation Torch, the coming invasion of Europe, all this stuff, if we can't get the right amount if we can't build up supplies here, then none of these great operations are going to pan out." Yeah. So there were divisions between King and the Brits, and that's one of the reasons why King had such a terrible reputation and at the Admiralty in London. They thought he was impossible to work with, and he kind of was. But
yeah, it was
in many respects, everyone thought that. It wasn't just the Brits. I mean, it was like George Marshall thought he was a real pain in the neck. I mean, everyone hated him.
Yeah.
Was it that King said, when the going gets tough, they send for the sons of bitches? So he was one. Hey, everybody, we're chatting with Alex Rose, who's the author of the book Phantom Fleet, about the capture of the U-505. So let's talk about the capture of the U-505. The task force that goes after this submarine, and they really go after this specific submarine. They are really looking for it, is headed by Admiral Dan Galley. So who is he, and what is this task force? And I'm going to ask three questions. And why are they looking for the 505?
Well, can I tack on? Can I ask tack on?
Let's get a fourth question in there. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Sure.
And what does DDLM stand for?
Well, to answer the fourth question first, and it will make no sense to anybody watching here, it's Dan, the lavatory man.
Okay, good.
Which is a nickname for Dan Gallery, right? Or it's how he signs
himself. It was when he was dealing with a lot of British commodores and captains and so forth, and they all had DSO or CBE, OBE after their names, and so they were surprised that he didn't have any sort of suffixes for his honors, and so he said, "Well, you can just call me. I'm actually Daniel Gallery, DDLM," and they were very confused by this until they explained that it was Dan Lavatory Man.
Which kind of gives you a clue to his personality. He's a little kind of off the wall kind of guy.
Dan Gallery was one of the great naval, one of the naval greats, I guess, and probably to get my words in the right order. One of the great eccentrics. He was a character in the U.S. Navy, and he was long known as it. He had a very he was the son of a sort of this mirthless Chicago lawyer, highly Irish Catholic, who'd gone to the Naval Academy because his dad wanted him to, he was he had this quite corny sense of humor, the sort of very kind of 1930s kind of cheekiness to him. And he was well liked. He wasn't like the greatest naval commander of all time, but he was very, very good at his job. His men loved him. He was a great inspirational leader, and he was funny. And people, kind of like that. Even Ernest King thought he was quite entertaining, which is saying something.
Whoa. Okay.
But he'd started the war as a captain, based essentially in Iceland at a commander of a naval air base, and that was where what had happened there was he was in charge of sort of sending out planes, Catalinas, to escort Allied convoys across, through south of Iceland, sort of thing, on the sort of the northern route. And his planes weren't getting anything, typical, because they didn't really have the training and the anti-submarine technology to do this. And so he said, until someone sinks a submarine around here, I'm closing the officers' bar, which was, greeted with horror. And miraculously, soon afterwards, one of the officers actually managed to take a submarine, sort of sink a submarine. And so the bar was open that night. And Gallery and his boys, they get really, really hammered. I mean, there wasn't much else to do at the Iceland base. And it was late at night, and they began talking about, and Gallery later says, this is just drunk guy talk, sounds like a fantastic idea until you actually think about it the next morning with a hangover. It was essentially like, we could have captured that submarine, earlier today if we'd really tried. Like, how would you do it? And the idea was that they would land the Catalina next to the submarine. They would jump over the wing or something onto the deck of the submarine. They would get a heavy chain and they would throw it down the conning tower hatch to prevent it being closed. They would throw a grenade down to take care of any recalcitrant Germans down there, and then they would just take the submarine and sail it in triumph. And it was going to be really easy. And but they eventually woke up and the next day and said that was probably the dumbest idea we've ever had. In that, how would you land a Catalina with 8 men? I think it was an 8-man crew on very violent waves in stormy weather, windy weather, right next to a submarine which has 50 men on it, which has deck guns that are going to be shooting at you at the same time. This is impossible. But it still left this sort of it grew it was sort of sowed a seed in Gallery's head, in the back of his mind about how would you take a submarine, because he really just, there was no real other purpose for it aside from he just wanted to be the John Paul Jones of the U.S. Navy.
Just to be clear here, so when is this big bust up at the bar where he says, let's just go do this? Like, when
this was in May 1942. Middle of 1942.
2 years before.
Yeah. So for 2 years, he nurtures this idea.
Yeah, he wasn't working on it all the time. It was, he had other jobs to do. But it was always his sort of great dream in life. That was what it was. And so when he did eventually get command of a task under Guadalcanal, which is a kind of it's like a pocket carrier that they sort of hammered together. It was basically a freighter with a flat deck, screwed in on top. These are part of the new hunter-killer groups that was part of King's plan of, well, we've done the defensive strategy. Now we're going to be more aggressive. We're going to create these hunter-killer groups, and they are going to go hunt and kill U-boats. And so that you would have a few of them in the Atlantic. You would have Guadalcanal and Cod and a few others, and they would be escorted by sort of 4 destroyers. And they had a small complement of planes, but they were nowhere near as large or as powerful or as armored as the giants in the Pacific. Those were that we're more accustomed to. These were little things. I don't even know if they had any armor because nobody was attacking them. But he gets command of the Guadalcanal, but he, even from its very first, almost like its shakedown voyage, he is doing weird stuff. He has a new green crew of sort of, as he says, sort of farm boys. Many of them, sort of 80% of them had never seen an ocean before, and so they don't know any better. And he's doing weird stuff like, hey, let's get this chain and let's see if we can tow a destroyer behind us. Let's see what happens. Let's train this. And why else would you need that? And they didn't know any better, so they didn't ask any questions, as he said. They just thought this was sort of standard operating procedure for an aircraft carrier to be towing destroyers. But it was really just training. He was seeing whether it could be done, that if you can tow a destroyer, you can tow a submarine that you've captured. So this was always part of the plan. And all he wanted was to get this U-boat, which nobody had done. The British had done it, sort of, but it was public knowledge. And that had been years before. He wanted an American one. Wow. Any submarines that had been almost captured before had always been scuttled, or they had sunk. They were just too heavily damaged. He wanted to capture one of these things, one of these beasts in the wild, and take it in alive. And that's what he set out to do. And that's when he went to Washington when he was on leave, and he said, I need a submarine that I can hunt. Give me the name and number, kind of thing. Wow. And that's how it all began. This was in early 1944, to give you some context.
Okay. Why is it hard to capture a submarine?
The reason is that there are, without getting into too many details, submarines operate in cubic dimensions. They can be on the surface, they can be underwater, obviously. They can run on their electric engines, or motors rather, underwater, quite almost silently. They can descend to certain depth, obviously their crush depth. But if they're on the surface of the ocean, they can use their diesels, and they get many hundreds of miles. So what you're dealing with is not only this colossal potential area on the surface of a weapon that is essentially 700, 800 feet long. It's like a little sliver. Or it can be underwater in just imagine a kind of a cylinder, with the surface of the ocean surface being the sort of the top of the can, so to speak, and it descending like a Campbell soup can. So it can be anywhere in there within, its operating range. Now that doesn't sound like a lot until you realize that, that is a colossal volume of water that this thing can hide in. I mean, it's trillions and trillions and trillions of cubic feet of water. Now, it's okay if you've got great anti-submarine tracking technology, like you've got first-rate sonar, you've got radar for the surface, also you've got radio transmissions to kind of try and sort of filter down where it could possibly be. But they didn't. The Americans and the British didn't really have a lot of that stuff in the early part of the war. So essentially, these are submarines that can run and hide and be anywhere. If you give up the chase, as many destroyers did after about an hour after an attack on a convoy, say, you'd never see that submarine again. It was gone forever. So that's what makes submarines so hard to find. They don't broadcast their presence. Let's put it that way. And when you do see them, it means you've just had a torpedo launched at you. So, and then they escape.
It's also that if that the submarine commanders, they'd rather be sunk than be captured, right?
Yes, they had orders from Dönitz. These were absolute orders that if you were in any danger, any risk of capture, you scuttle that. You scuttle your command. And now, a lot of the time, this wasn't really a problem because by the latter stages of the war, the Allied anti-submarine tactics were, first rate. If they cornered a submarine, then it was almost certainly dead. It would just sustain such huge damage from depth bombs and depth charges and forward-firing hedgehogs and aircraft spotters and torpedoes and what were known as FIDOs, which are essentially sort of torpedoes that were launched, and they would use sonar to try and pick up where the submarine was and then track it and follow it. This stuff was devastating to U-boat crews. But the fact is that submarine commanders did not want to be captured, not only to protect German technology, but also to protect the Enigma machine, which was sort of really uppermost in Dönitz's mind. If the Allies captured the Enigma machines, the whole game's up essentially. So what German submarines were equipped with scuttling charges along their keel. But only I think the chief engineer and the captain kind of knew how to do that. they there were also many faucets and valves and ways to open up that you could bring in water, and obviously this submarine would sink, and preferably after the crew had gotten out. So there are several ways to do it. A lot of time it didn't really matter because, as I said, the Allied anti-submarine techniques were so good that this wasn't really this was kind of a moot question, in the sense that you didn't even see the submarine because you blew it up 100 feet under the water. So this wasn't a question of ever having to surrender. You were dead anyway. So yeah, so that's one of the that's what one of the things that Gallery on Guadalcanal wanted to exploit, the German willingness to if they could get to the surface, get the crew off, then sink the ship. That left a little window of opportunity if the submarine, crucially, wasn't fatally damaged. So that's what he had to work on. He had to get to that submarine before, and tell his airplane pilots and his destroyer captains, don't hold it fatally. We need that submarine. Just get the crew off so we can get people on board and try and fix it up.
All right. So as often happens, we've gotten so into our conversation. I looked up and like, oh my God, we're starting to run out of time here, and I want to talk more about the 505 and actually capturing it. And I've got to tell people, please buy the book, read it. There's so much in here, and there's so much stuff we haven't touched on. And it breaks my heart that I couldn't talk more about the Royal Navy, but they're in there too. But getting back to 505, and because we have a long-time viewer whose father was actually involved in the seizure of 505, why don't we talk about what happened? And Wally Morrison has asked two questions. He says, what communication did Captain Gallery receive that sent him on the hunt for U-505? And then he asks again about, please talk about the bravery of the boarding party. So without giving too much away in terms of getting people to buy the book, why don't you tell us about the actual seizure of 505, how it happened, what was involved?
Well, this is all going to be this is nutshell history.
Absolutely, yeah. It's
in the book, it takes up, but to keep things very, very short and simple, the Guadalcanal task group was hunting U-505 for several weeks. The commander of U-505 was, he was no rookie. He knew that there was a hunter-killer group after him, and he had no intention of being caught. He was off the west coast of Africa. He was on his way home. And just by, in Gallery on board the Guadalcanal had been hunting for so long that, I think his chief engineer, a rather worried man, said, we're running on fumes, chief, or boss. In 12 hours time, we're going to be stuck out in the middle of nowhere, and we're going to have to get a tow home, and that would be the end of everybody's career, because you don't want to have an aircraft carrier running out of fuel in the middle of the Atlantic. It's very embarrassing. No way Captain Gallery was ever going to be Admiral Gallery. Let's put it that way. And but Gallery just uses his gut and says, this guy's close. I know he is. Run it for 12 hours exactly. Let's see if we can get him. I know he's here. Now the U-boat captain had been very wily, very cunning, and had been evading them. But then, and this is where you get into these questions of sort of fate versus fortune and this kind of thing. It's, essentially the U-boat commander made a left turn, and if he had made a right turn at that particular moment, the two never would have met. But it just so happened that left turn brought him like this at 11:09 a.m. on June 4th with the Guadalcanal hunter-killer group. And that was it. So now they had him. And, there was a fight. The U-boat captain tried to get away. And Gallery, we had the transcripts of Galleries of all the the radio signals between the task group commanders and the airplane pilots and so on. And you can hear Gallery shouting, I want that ship, stop shooting. So they eventually stopped, and the submarine came to the surface, and they managed to scare the crew off. That's what they were mostly concerned with, because they didn't want to have a fight down in a very compressed metal guys underwater with a bunch of guys, with grenades going off and things like that. So they managed to get the crew off. And then at that point, as Gallery had planned, the destroyers sent in. Well, that's a picture of the tow afterward. You're giving the spoiler away there.
All right. Jeez, Rick.
Got an American flag in it
It's
too.
the pictures of God. Yeah.
Away. And loss of suspense. But essentially, they sent the little whaleboats over with little boarding teams. This is getting back to Wally's. Your viewers.
Wally Morrison.
These boarding parties are essentially like buccaneers in a way, who'd been kind of volunteered or had volunteered to be on board these little whaleboats, and 12, 15 men, and that would race over and jump on board the deck, and then try and get inside. I mean, nobody really knew that much about what it was like inside one of these submarines, because none of them had ever been captured alive. They had sort of vague ideas from prisoner interrogations and so on. But it was all a bit of guesswork. So one of these, they were essentially. I looked into the first boarding whaleboat crew, and again, I think they're typical of all of them, and again, probably typical of the vast majority of the men on board these ships at the time. They were all 20 years old, 19, 20 years old. Half of them, essentially there's sort of almost a stereotype of sort of apple pie guys who like local sports teams and have a college high school sweetheart, that kind of stuff, and they just thought it was a lark. They just thought it was fun, not knowing really that this was an incredibly dangerous thing to do, to board an unknown enemy weapon, essentially, and not knowing whether the captain had set all the scuttling charges to go off 2 minutes after they had gotten on board, or what was waiting for them. Some, a bunch of fanatics willing to die for the Führer with machine guns and so on. They had no idea, but they just went in there, and one of them would be armed with a Tommy gun. Another guy had like a sort of a brace of grenades, and another guy was an engineer, and another guy was a torpedo expert. Another guy was a radio guy. And they just went in there, and the first whaleboat crew went in not knowing, and they were the first Americans to board or enter, board an enemy warship at sea like this since, I think, as you said earlier, since the War of 1812. It was quite an achievement. It was a real achievement. Yeah. And they got down there, and again they noticed that it was listing bad. It was in the U-505 was actually in very bad shape. You can see, I think, in that earlier photo, you can see it's pretty low in the water, and that was after they had tried to salvage it, but it was taking on water pretty considered. That's when it's in pretty good shape. It had because a couple of the German crewmen had managed to open. Those are the Americans attaching the tow cable. But you can see it at the stern. You can see how low it is in the water. So it's clearly filled with water in there. So they managed to get on board, and it took them a long time. There's a kind of long stories about how they managed to do it, but they actually managed, thanks to the sort of heroic efforts of a couple of guys, to manage to right this ship. And of course, the guys inside the engineers trying to work out how all of these. They weren't submarine men. They were ship guys. They didn't know any German, for one thing, so they didn't know if you pressed that red button what would happen. I mean, either maybe a torpedo would launch, or the ship would blow up, or something would happen. So they had to sort of work it out as they went, but they did manage to salvage it, and they did manage to raise it in the water to make it stable. And it was a great story. So that's it's considerably more complicated than that.
Absolutely, yes. And you should read the book to get the whole story, because
you should definitely read the book.
Compelling, yes.
There's so much more I want to ask about, but the question that really strikes me is one to perhaps end on is how does this submarine? I mean, because you could talk about the prisoners, you could talk about the code breaking, how the code breaking capture of that equipment in the logbooks affects the whole code breaking thing. Mm-hmm. But the thing I want to know about, how did that submarine get to Chicago? Why did it end up at the university, at the Museum of Science and Industry? in Chicago because I live in Chicago. So
And why did Rick and I have to wait in such a long line to get in to see it?
Yeah, I mean, you guys should have your own special line,
I think so.
VIP
I think
line.
I think after our cruise experience, I'm sure we will. Yeah.
Did they not know who you are?
Exactly.
What's with the belt? They
We'll
should
have
have
him back, Rick. We'll have him back.
Yeah. You have worked your way into our hearts.
Exclusive museum exhibit in town.
Next week's guest, more of Alex Rose.
But essentially, just to answer your question quite shortly, in a short way, it was really due to the efforts of Dan Gallery, who was from Chicago,
Wow.
and he wanted to bring some pride to the hometown. And it was, a strange. I mean, it's a strange place for a German U-boat to be in Chicago.
Fair enough.
But the weird thing is that just after the war, the U.S. Navy had thousands of ships it was going to scrap. I mean, they had hundreds and hundreds of destroyers and Liberty ships and all this stuff that they didn't need anymore. So it was all being scrapped. And U-505 was kind of one of these ships that was about to be sort of junked. And there was some officer who was just going down this list, and he saw, USS this, USS that, USS that, and he saw U-505. He said, "What's that? Isn't that Dan Gallery's bag?" So he contacted. It was a strange thing, and it was kind of this rust bucket that had been used for some trials and experimentation and so on, because everyone forgot about it. So Dan Gallery goes, "Wow, that's great! I want to save U-505, not only for a trophy for the hometown, but a kind of a, to be honest, a kind of a trophy for himself. Our greatest war trophy of all."
Right.
So he managed to, raise money. It's a fundraiser. By that time, I go into it in the book, but it was super top secret during the war, including even keeping the crew segregated from all the other prisoners in the U.S. Because they couldn't let Dönitz know that we're having any inkling that the 505 had actually been captured. Otherwise, he would have changed all the codes and all this kind of stuff. But the U.S. Navy had released a big press release in 1945, cheering it on. And so they just there's a great photo of the U-505. It's a rather strange picture, sailing underneath the Brooklyn Bridge of all places. And then it was over the next couple of years, and it was a kind of, again, fundraising. Gallery went to dinners. He wrote to lots of people to say, "Hey, please donate money to this." It's a great sort of campaign by Gallery, and it was for the first time that he actually brought out a lot of the crew. Because the crew had all been sworn by him to secrecy. It's quite funny, all the stuff he threatened them with if they said anything. So they'd all been very loyal and not open their mouths at all. But it was in the early 50s, very early 50s, that suddenly there were these dinners in which crewmen were being honored with toasts from Gallery, and they oftentimes their wives hadn't even known. These men took their oaths of secrecy very, very strictly in those days. And eventually they went through all the canals, and they managed to get it to Chicago, and they kept it outside, and they fixed it up as best they can. It was only, I can't remember the exact day. It was relatively recently that they managed to build a whole wing for this thing, which I visited a few years ago when I was doing research for the book. And it's spectacular, and the U-505 is in a magnificent condition. And they've got this magnificent addition to what's now the Griffin Museum of Science and Industry. And again, if you are ever in or anywhere near Chicago, it is really well worth seeing. But once you actually see one of these things up close, it is actually quite spectacular.
Yeah. So, Alex, I mean, kind of like as a last wrap up, why is this story important? We have one of our viewers, David Picker, who said, "What was the advantage? What did we get from capturing it? And is that important, or is it the story that's important? What is it?"
Again, that is a great question. It's one that I wrestled with, because we all want the story of the capture of U-505, which changed the tide of war. It won the war for the Allies. You always want that great headline book. And I was thinking about it, and you have to be honest in history books. You can't make up stuff. You can't be a fantasist. And the
Right.
fact that, but you have to, you want to get to the truth. And the truth, as I saw it, and just reading all of Gallery's correspondence and reading everything that would have been written about 505 and researched and so on, is that, it didn't change the course of the war. By June 1944, the Americans, and I go into this in the book about the what I call Bletchley Parkitis. That is an over focus on Bletchley Park in England. Whereas by 1944, American Enigma programs were, they had basically completely taken over naval decryption. It's quite an extraordinary story that's really quite untold, I think. But it's, by that time the Americans could read Enigma. Now there were some blanks and blackouts here and there, and yes, the Americans hadn't been keen on taking 505 because it was so close to D-Day, and if something had gone wrong on board that boat, and Dönitz found out that a boat had been taken, which meant probably that an Enigma machine had been taken, he would have changed all the codes essentially on the eve of D-Day or thereabouts. Now, naval-wise, it doesn't matter that much, but remember the German army and the Luftwaffe and German high command were all using Enigma, and if the Allies can't break land communications or air communications during the invasion of France, then you've got a real problem. Yeah. So it was a very risky mission. It wasn't just a bit of daring do for no reason at all. But at the same time, they still sort of snuffle out those doubts, and they went ahead with it. I mean, Gallery had full authority to do this. They didn't really think he could pull it off. But the important thing is, and this is what I figured out, is that no, it didn't change the course of the war. It didn't. The Germans didn't suddenly lose the war because they lost a submarine. Right. At the end of the day, it was just kind of a glorious adventure on the high seas. Yeah. And they brought in some very valuable intelligence documents, but realistically, Gallery wasn't interested in that. He just brought them in because he promised the guy in Washington that he would bring it in. But it was Gallery's sense of fun, and he just wanted to pull this off for the glory of it all. It was a hell of a thing. And like some people want to climb Everest for the first time. Some people want to explore an undiscovered area of the jungle. It's just one of these things that don't really add that much in terms of importance, but at the same time are pretty spectacular in their own right. And that was at the nub of it all. That is the story of U-505.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, Alex, I mean, Rick is, I don't know what Rick is doing. He's far, but I want to thank you. It's an absolutely fantastic book. Please read it. There's so much more we didn't get to. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me on. Thanks for letting me sort of speak at length, as they say.
No, we loved it. So thanks very much. Good luck, and keep in touch.
All right. Thanks very much.
Okay. And now we move on to February.
Like that.
It's like that.
No.
January's over. February's coming.
Wow.
Next month in February is Black History Month, and we have this year set up 4 shows focusing on that. Cheryl has really worked hard to put this together.
Some really good books.
We appreciate that. So we're going to start off February 1 with Kings and Pawns by Howard Bryant, which is a look at Jackie Robinson and Paul Robeson, who are 2 huge figures of the post-war era, 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
Forgotten Souls is the second book. It is the search for the, where is it, Rick? Okay.
There you go.
The search for the lost Tuskegee Airmen. I don't know
We will find out how they got lost.
who they are and how they got lost, but we are going to find that out and talk to Cheryl Thompson. Then the third week on February 15th, we're going to interview Brooke Newman about the book The Crown's Silence, and this is about the British monarchy and American slavery. You're a little skeptical of this.
I'm a little, I don't know, we're going to see.
Well, we'll find out. Maybe it'll just be a huge, wonderful revelation. And then February 22nd, Somewhere Towards Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation by Bennett Parton. So that's what's coming up.
I always feel like we don't do enough Civil War stuff. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I don't feel we do enough stuff harassing the British monarchy. So, I think we're covering a lot of bases here. And have we ever done anything on the Tuskegee Airmen?
I can't remember.
I don't think so.
We have. No.
I don't think so. So really some stuff to look forward to in February. And so we hope you'll join us for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, meantime, please subscribe to us on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.